Have you ever stopped mid-sentence and suddenly forgotten what you were going to say? Have you ever walked into a room and stood there for a few seconds trying to remember why you were there? Or opened your phone to do something specific and minutes later, realized you had no idea why? If this has ever happened to you, stick with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. These situations seem small, almost trivial, but when they start to repeat themselves, something changes. That uncomfortable feeling arises that the mind isn't working as it should. Many young adults go through this in silence, wondering if they are becoming too distracted, too inattentive, or even less capable than before. And almost always the conclusion is harsh. I must have a bad memory, I can't concentrate anymore, something is wrong with me. But what if I told you that, in most cases, this isn't forgetfulness? And that it also has nothing to do with lack of intelligence, laziness, or mental carelessness. What's happening is something bigger, and much more common than you imagine. There is a deeply ingrained idea that youth is the absolute peak of brain function. That the young brain is fast, efficient, focused, almost unbeatable. But the cognitive reality of this phase of life is quite different. Paradoxically, it is precisely among young adults that cognitive failures seem to become more frequent, more noticeable, and more frustrating. And here's an important point: cognitive lapses don't mean loss of ability. They manifest as lapses in attention, momentary memory difficulties, temporary mental confusion, loss of train of thought, or that strange feeling of a muddled mind. It's not that the brain has stopped working properly, it's that it's functioning under very specific conditions. Have you ever experienced this? That feeling that your head is always full, always racing, always too busy to think clearly? The young adult brain lives in a radically different environment from any previous generation. It is constantly bombarded by stimuli, information, quick decisions, social pressures, professional expectations, and continuous comparisons. All of this consumes mental resources and takes its toll. The most curious thing is that these cognitive lapses tend to occur precisely in intelligent, active, and highly functional people. People who work, study, stay informed, and are constantly connected. The more the brain is challenged, the greater the chance of it experiencing small short circuits along the way. Not because it's weak, but because it's overloaded. And when these lapses happen, the emotional reaction is usually immediate: frustration, worry, self-criticism. Many begin to wonder if this is normal, if it's a sign of something more serious, or if they are losing control of their own minds. But few people stop to understand what is really behind these experiences. Throughout this video, you will understand why young adults experience more cognitive lapses, what brain mechanisms are involved, and why this phase of life creates the perfect scenario for this type of phenomenon. And, most importantly, you will realize that these lapses say much more about the environment you live in than about who you are. So stick with me, because now that you've recognized these signs in your daily life, it's time to take a closer look at what's really happening inside your brain, and the explanation begins precisely where most people never look. And perhaps most importantly, realize that you're not alone in this. These experiences that seem so individual, the lapse, the confusion, the sudden blank, are happening to many people at the same time, silently. Each person thinks the problem is only theirs, when in fact there's a pattern, a context, a common brain function behind it all. And talking about it completely changes how we see ourselves. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below describing what has touched you the most so far. It could be a specific experience you've had, a recurring feeling, or even a question you've never dared to ask anyone. When you write, other people recognize themselves in it, and that's how this conversation gains strength and becomes something collective, not solitary. If at any point during this video you thought, "This explains a lot," liking the video is a simple way to show that this content is valuable to you. This gesture helps the channel reach more people who are also trying to understand their own brains, without judgment or easy labels. Subscribing to the channel is like saying, "I want to continue this conversation." Because the idea here isn't to scare you or oversimplify, but to explain what happens inside the human mind in a clear, human, and accessible way. Your participation, commenting, liking, subscribing, is what keeps this space alive and makes this message reach further. Now that you've recognized these signs in yourself, the next part begins to reveal why the young adult brain so easily enters this state, and what exactly is happening behind the scenes in your mind. There's a silent belief that accompanies almost every young adult, even if it's rarely put into words: the idea that the mind should be at its absolute peak. Quick, sharp, organized, always ready to respond, decide, and produce. It's as if there's an invisible rule saying that at this stage of life, the brain doesn't have the right to fail. And when small cognitive lapses begin to appear, a sudden blank, an untimely distraction, a feeling of mental confusion, Something inside the person breaks even before any rational explanation can emerge. The reaction is almost always internal and harsh. I shouldn't be like this. My brain should be working better. Am I falling behind? This type of thinking doesn't stem from the actual functioning of the human mind, but from a deeply ingrained myth, the myth of the peak mind. The idea that youth automatically equates to constant mental clarity, unwavering focus, and impeccable cognitive performance. But this expectation doesn't correspond to the reality of what's happening behind the scenes in the brain. The hidden truth is that the young adult brain does exhibit important biological peaks, such as high neural plasticity and processing speed. But this doesn't mean mental stability. Quite the opposite. This phase of life is usually one of the most cognitively demanding of all. The brain is not only dealing with learning but with managing complexity. It needs to organize decisions, emotions, expectations, social pressures, and future projections, all at the same time. Young adults live a continuous journey of choices. Some are big, others seemingly insignificant, but all demand mental energy. Which path to follow, who to become, how to position oneself, how to be seen, how to perform, how not to make mistakes. Even during moments of rest, the mind continues working behind the scenes, processing scenarios, comparisons, fears, and possibilities. This constant activity consumes real, though often invisible, cognitive resources. There is also a silent transformation at this stage of life. The brain ceases to function solely as an organ for absorbing knowledge and begins to operate as a decision-making center. It needs to balance professional responsibilities, personal relationships, social identity, external expectations, and internal needs. It is an overlapping of roles that has rarely existed with such intensity in other phases of life. When the mind is expected to function perfectly within this scenario, the pressure becomes too heavy. And it is precisely this pressure that distorts how cognitive failures are interpreted. A simple lapse in memory ceases to be an isolated incident and begins to be seen as a sign of incapacity. A distraction becomes proof of incompetence. A moment of confusion transforms into a cause for anxiety. The emotional impact of this misinterpretation is profound and silent. The brain doesn't respond well to constant internal attacks. It doesn't adjust better when pressured in this way. On the contrary, when faced with excessive demands, it enters a more defensive mode, prioritizing emotional containment and psychological survival. This reduces access to more refined cognitive functions, such as working memory, verbal clarity, and sustained focus. Not because something is broken, but because something is being demanded beyond what is healthy. Another point that is rarely discussed is the mental environment in which young adults are immersed. We live surrounded by stimuli, information, notifications, and simultaneous demands. Everything happens quickly all the time. There is an illusion of efficiency, as if keeping up with this pace were synonymous with productivity and intelligence. But the human brain was not designed to function in a state of continuous alertness. For thoughts to organize and memories to consolidate, the mind needs real pauses. It needs silence, intervals, moments when nothing urgent is happening. When this doesn't exist, the brain may receive information, but it can't process it in depth. The result is a mind that is full and, at the same time, not very functional. A constant feeling of mild, but persistent, confusion. This overload doesn't manifest as obvious physical fatigue. It appears in a more subtle way: difficulty concentrating, memory lapses, loss of train of thought, a feeling of always being one step behind one's own life. As if the mind were trying to keep up with something too fast, without time to reorganize itself. This experience generates an internal disconnection that is difficult to explain, but easy to recognize. The most curious thing is that many of these cognitive failures arise precisely in committed, responsible, and mentally active people. People who care, who overthink, who try to handle everything. The brain doesn't fail due to lack of interest or ability. It fails due to overinvolvement. It's the cost of being mentally present on many fronts at the same time for long periods, without adequate recovery. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the myth of the peak mind completely changes how these failures are interpreted. When you realize that you're not facing cognitive decline, but a poorly understood overload, something reorganizes itself internally. Self-criticism begins to lose its power and curiosity takes over. Instead of asking yourself, "What's wrong with me?" a much more honest and powerful question arises: what is demanding so much from my mind at this point in my journey? This shift in mindset is transformative. It removes the burden of judgment and opens up space for understanding. Because cognitive failures are not the opposite of intelligence. Often they are a direct consequence of a mind being used without breaks, without clear limits and without room for recovery. The young adult brain is not weak. It is overloaded by continuous decisions, expectations, and stimuli. As this perception begins to form, new details become evident. The impact of excessive daily choices, pressure for performance, constant comparison, and lack of real mental rest. Small revelations gradually emerge, showing that these flaws are messages from the brain, not defects. Signs that something in the rhythm, internal organization, or way of dealing with one's own demands needs to be observed more closely. This understanding changes the relationship with one's own mind. Instead of fear, awareness arises. Instead of guilt, clarity begins to appear. And it is from this clarity that it becomes possible to understand what is really happening behind the scenes in the young adult brain, and why this phase of life creates the perfect setting for this type of cognitive experience. If this started to resonate with you in any way, comment below. This makes sense to me. There is another central element in this story that almost no one notices, but which has a profound impact on the functioning of the young adult mind: the illusion of multitasking. We live surrounded by the idea that being productive means doing many things at the same time, responding quickly, switching between tasks nonstop, keeping several tabs open, several applications active, several conversations happening in parallel. This has been normalized to the point of seeming like a sign of competence. But, behind the scenes in the brain, the reality is quite different. The human brain wasn't designed to perform multiple cognitive tasks simultaneously. What it does, in practice, is switch focus extremely rapidly. It leaves one task, enters another, returns, leaves again, and repeats this cycle dozens or hundreds of times throughout the day. Each notification, each new tab opened, each visual or auditory stimulus forces this switching. And every switch has a mental cost. This cost doesn't appear dramatically. It accumulates. With each shift in focus, the brain needs to readjust, recover the previous context, remember where it was, and reconstruct the line of reasoning. When this happens repeatedly, small lapses begin to appear. A forgotten detail, a piece of information that doesn't stick, a sentence interrupted midway. These are microlapses in attention that, added together, create a feeling of mental confusion. The most curious thing is that, from a subjective point of view, the person feels like they are doing everything at the same time. But from a neurological point of view, the brain is constantly being interrupted. It never enters a deep state of focus. It never has enough time to consolidate information. It never fully completes processing before being pulled away by another demand. The result is a fragmented mind. This fragmentation manifests itself in very specific ways. Short-term memory begins to fail. The person forgets what they were going to look for, what they were going to say, what they just read. Not because the memory is weak, but because attention did not remain focused long enough on the same point for that information to be registered solidly. Without sustained attention, there is no reliable memory. There is also a constant sense of mental urgency. As if something is always about to happen, always demanding an immediate response. Even when there is no concrete task, the brain remains in a state of alert. This continuous state prevents the cognitive relaxation necessary to organize thoughts. The mind becomes too busy to be clear. Social media plays a significant role in this process. It trains the brain to constantly seek novelty. Each scroll brings something new, each short video demands only a few seconds of attention, each stimulus is quickly replaced by another. Over time, this conditions the mind to avoid depth. Long thoughts become uncomfortable. Focusing on a single thing for several minutes begins to feel tiring, almost boring. This conditioning is not a moral defect, nor a character flaw. It is an adaptation. The brain is simply responding to the environment in which it has been placed. However, this adaptation has side effects. When it is necessary to maintain focus, reason calmly, or access internal information, the mind seems to escape. Not because it cannot, but because it has been trained not to remain focused. The young adult, then, finds himself trapped in a contradiction. He lives in an environment that demands speed, immediate response, and multitasking, but demands clarity, perfect memory, and continuous concentration from himself. When these two things conflict, frustration and self-criticism arise. The person begins to believe that there is something wrong with his mental capacity, when in fact the conflict lies between the natural functioning of the brain and the artificial demands of the environment. This hidden truth is rarely discussed. The dominant narrative values those who can handle everything. But the cognitive cost of this attitude is never addressed. Each interruption seems small, but the accumulated impact is significant. The mind becomes reactive, not reflective. It responds but doesn't delve deeper. It reacts but doesn't organize. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the false concept of multitasking completely changes how these cognitive failures are perceived. When you begin to see that you are not losing capacity, but rather scattering your attention, something adjusts internally. The feeling of incompetence begins to give way to an understanding of the environmental impact on the mind. This shift in mindset is part of a silent transformation. Instead of fighting against their own brain, the person begins to observe how it is being used. They start to notice how often their focus is interrupted, how many decisions are made without pause, how much information enters without time for processing. This observation reveals important behind-the-scenes aspects of mental functioning. And when these behind-the-scenes aspects begin to become visible, small revelations emerge. The confusion doesn't come from an excess of tasks, but from an excess of switching between things. Forgetfulness doesn't come from a lack of memory, but from a lack of sustained attention. The mind isn't weak, it's fragmented. And fragmentation isn't a destiny, it's a state. This understanding creates space for something new. A more honest relationship with one's own mental rhythm. A clearer perception of the impact of daily decisions on attention. The journey ceases to be a desperate attempt to function better, and becomes a process of alignment between mind, environment, and expectations. And when this clarity begins to form, it becomes easier to understand why these microglitches become so frequent precisely at this stage of life, and how other, even more silent factors continue to influence the brain in ways that almost no one notices. If this resonated with you on any level, write this down. I'm on this journey too. There is also a silent saboteur working behind the scenes in the young adult brain, so present in daily life that it is rarely recognized as a real problem. Sleep deprivation. It's not just about that isolated bad night's sleep, but a continuous pattern of insufficient, fragmented, or superficial rest that accumulates over time. This accumulation doesn't cause an immediate collapse, doesn't trigger clear alarms, but slowly corrodes essential mental functions, creating exactly the kind of cognitive impairments that so many people experience without understanding why. Sleeping too little has become almost normalized. For many young adults, pulling all-nighters, reducing sleep hours, or sleeping irregularly seems like an inevitable part of the routine. Some associate this with productivity, resilience, or even ambition. But the brain doesn't see it that way. For it, lack of sleep is not a challenge to be overcome, but a constant signal of threat. And the brain's response to a prolonged threat is simple: to conserve energy wherever possible. Sleep is not just a break between one day and the next. It is an active, complex, and absolutely necessary process for healthy cognitive functioning. It is during sleep that the brain organizes memories, selects what is relevant, discards excess, strengthens important connections, and rebalances internal systems. When this process is repeatedly interrupted or shortened, the brain cannot complete its work. It begins the next day carrying cognitive baggage from the previous day. One of the first impacts appears in memory. Recent information seems to slip away easily. Names, appointments, simple tasks, details of conversations. The person feels like they just saw that, but can't access it. This generates frustration and insecurity. The central point is that the memory isn't weak, it's poorly consolidated. Without enough sleep, the brain receives information, but it can't transform it into stable records. Attention is also profoundly affected. Maintaining focus requires continuous cognitive effort, and a sleep-deprived brain enters a saving mode. It does the bare minimum necessary to keep the person functional, but reduces the ability to sustain attention for long periods. The result is a mind that is easily distracted, loses the thread of thought, and feels constantly overwhelmed even by simple tasks. Small interruptions take on a disproportionate impact. Decision-making suffers an even more subtle yet dangerous impact. With little rest, the brain begins to operate more automatically and less reflectively. Decisions that would require careful analysis become impulsive. Evaluating consequences, considering alternatives, and thinking in the medium term requires an effort that the tired brain avoids. This affects daily choices, relationships, professional performance, and even how a person reacts emotionally to challenges. The most insidious aspect of sleep deprivation is that it distorts the perception of normalcy. When someone sleeps poorly for weeks, months, or years, that mental state begins to seem standard. Mild confusion, feelings of inner fatigue, and difficulty concentrating cease to be seen as warning signs and are instead interpreted as personal traits. The hidden truth is that many young adults live in chronic sleep debt without ever naming it as a problem. This debt isn't resolved with the occasional good night. The brain needs regularity, complete cycles, predictability. It needs to know there will be enough time to reorganize itself. When this doesn't happen, deficits accumulate. And these deficits manifest themselves exactly as memory lapses, mental confusion, and difficulty focusing, creating the feeling that something is wrong, but without an obvious cause. There is also a profound emotional impact in this process. A tired brain regulates emotions poorly. Tolerance for frustration decreases, irritability increases, and patience shortens. Small mistakes begin to generate intense reactions. This creates a silent cycle. The more tired the brain is, the more the person demands of themselves, and the more they demand of themselves, the harder it becomes to truly rest. Mindset comes into direct conflict with biology. The young adult then tries to compensate. More coffee, more stimuli, more screen time, more effort. All of this creates the illusion of control, but doesn't solve the underlying problem. The brain continues to operate at a deficit. It may even sustain minimal functioning, but it loses clarity, depth, and consistency. Cognitive failures persist because the structure that supports mental performance is not being restored. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the role of sleep completely transforms how these failures are interpreted. When you understand that you're not getting worse, but functioning below what's necessary to operate well, something changes internally. Guilt begins to give way to understanding. Self-criticism loses its power. A more honest and useful question arises. How much of what I'm feeling is truly who I am, and how much is a direct consequence of how I'm sleeping? This question opens the door to important revelations. Many difficulties that seemed complex begin to make sense. Mental confusion ceases to be an inexplicable mystery. Distraction gains context. The feeling of always being tired, even without intense physical exertion, begins to have a concrete cause. The impact of sleep ceases to be abstract and becomes visible in daily life. This perception also influences decisions even subtly. The person begins to observe how small choices shape the functioning of the brain. Irregular schedules, constant stimuli at night, screens late into the night, all of this begins to be seen as part of the problem, not as something neutral. The journey ceases to be merely about surviving fatigue and becomes about understanding how the brain responds when it receives the minimum necessary to reorganize itself. And when that level of awareness begins to form, it becomes easier to see the big picture. Constant multitasking, mental overload, and sleep deprivation don't act in isolation. They combine, reinforce each other, and create a perfect scenario for frequent cognitive failures. The brain isn't failing by chance. It's reacting to a set of pressures that operate silently behind the scenes. This understanding sets the stage for looking even deeper into other factors that continue to influence the young adult mind in ways that are rarely discussed, but are crucial to understanding why these flaws become so common. If this resonated with you on any level, comment below. This makes sense to me. There is a factor that silently weaves together everything that has been said so far and that often goes unnoticed precisely because it is always present. Constant stress. Not the punctual stress in the face of a specific problem, but a prolonged state of tension that infiltrates the routine, the decisions, and even the way the young adult perceives their own life. A stress that doesn't scream, doesn't paralyze immediately, but keeps the brain in a state of continuous alert, as if something were always about to go wrong. This phase of life often involves very specific pressures. Financial stress, with bills, instability, and expectations of growth. Professional stress, with demands for performance, fear of making mistakes, constant comparison, and a feeling of always being evaluated. Social stress, with expectations of success, relationships, image, belonging, and validation. All of this happens simultaneously, without clear pauses between one demand and another. The brain doesn't interpret these pressures as abstract concepts. For it, stress is a threat. And when the threat becomes constant, the brain changes its way of operating. It enters survival mode. In this mode, the priority ceases to be clarity, creativity, refined memory, or strategic thinking. The priority becomes keeping the organism functioning, reacting quickly, and avoiding risks. This adjustment happens behind the scenes without warning. The person doesn't feel their brain changing modes. They only perceive the effects. Thinking becomes more difficult. Deciding becomes tiring. Remembering details requires effort. The mind seems narrower, less flexible. Not because something has been lost, but because certain cognitive functions are temporarily switched off to conserve energy. When stress is prolonged, the brain begins to operate in a state of constant vigilance. It constantly seeks signs of danger, error, or rejection. This consumes significant mental resources. Energy that could be used for concentration, learning, or memory is instead spent on emotional monitoring. The impact of this is profound but often mistaken for personal failure. In this state, the brain prefers quick responses to precise ones. It prefers automatic reactions to deep reflection. It prefers the known to the new. This directly affects decision-making. Choices are made based on immediate relief, not on long-term clarity. The mindset narrows. The vision of possibilities diminishes. The person feels they are always putting out fires, never calmly building something. Memory also suffers. Under continuous stress, the brain has difficulty registering new information in an organized way. It receives data but doesn't integrate it well. This generates lapses, forgetfulness, and that constant feeling of mental confusion. Thought seems fragmented, as if it were always incomplete. And this further increases stress, creating a silent cycle that is difficult to break. The most delicate aspect is that this survival mode begins to seem normal. The person gets used to living in a state of alert. Tension becomes the backdrop. Mental fatigue becomes part of their identity. Few realize that the brain is operating below its potential not due to incapacity, but due to adaptation to an environment perceived as hostile. There's a hidden truth here. The young adult brain isn't failing under stress. It's protecting itself. It reduces functions that aren't essential for immediate survival. But living in this mode for too long takes a heavy toll. Clarity diminishes. The feeling of control is lost. The mind always seems one step behind its own needs. This state also affects a person's relationship with themselves. Under constant stress, self-criticism intensifies. Small mistakes take on exaggerated weight. Confidence fluctuates. Comparison with others becomes more frequent. The brain, already overloaded, begins to expend even more energy trying to defend itself emotionally. The impact of this on the mental journey is profound. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the brain in survival mode completely changes how these cognitive failures are interpreted. When you realize that you are not less capable but more pressured, something reorganizes itself internally. Guilt begins to lose ground. Curiosity gains strength. The right question arises: what in my environment is being interpreted as a constant threat by my brain? This question opens a series of revelations. Many difficulties cease to seem random. Mental confusion gains context. Difficulty focusing begins to make sense. The feeling of always being tired, even without extreme physical exertion, is directly connected to a prolonged state of alertness. The impact of stress ceases to be invisible and becomes recognizable. This understanding also influences decisions, albeit gradually. The person begins to realize how certain pressures shape their mindset, their pace, and their ability to think clearly. The journey ceases to be merely about resisting stress and becomes about observing how the brain responds when the threat seems constant, even if it is not explicit. When this is understood, it becomes clear that excessive multitasking, sleep deprivation, and prolonged stress are not isolated factors. They combine and reinforce each other, creating a scenario where the brain spends much of its time trying to survive, not thrive cognitively. The resulting failures are not defects, but signs of a system operating at its limit. This understanding sets the stage for comprehending other, even more subtle elements that influence mental functioning at this stage of life, and how small shifts in consciousness can profoundly alter the way the brain interprets the world around it. If this resonated with you in any way, write this down: I'm on this journey too. There is an even deeper layer to this scenario that helps explain why so many young adults feel their memory is failing, even when they remain intelligent, curious, and mentally active. This layer has to do with information overload and insufficient consolidation. There is no lack of content, data, or stimuli. There is a lack of internal time for it all to make sense. The human brain wasn't designed to simply receive information continuously. It needs pauses. It needs intervals where nothing new enters so that what has already entered can be organized, classified, and integrated. It is in this silent space that memory is built. Without it, information may pass through the mind, but it doesn't stick. It passes through but doesn't establish itself. Young adults live immersed in a constant flow of fast, fragmented, and superficial information. Short news items, brief videos, instant messages, continuous updates. Everything arrives at high speed but stays for only a short time. The brain is exposed to an enormous amount of stimuli, but almost never has the chance to slow down enough to transform it into stable knowledge. This rhythm creates a dangerous illusion. The person feels that they are always informed, always connected, always learning something new. But, at the same time, they realize that they cannot remember details, clearly explain what they have just consumed, or connect ideas in a profound way. Then comes the feeling of failure. My memory is bad. I can't retain anything. it seems like everything is slipping away. The hidden truth is that, in most cases, memory isn't failing. It simply hasn't had time to do what it needs to do. Memory isn't an automatic storage system. It's a process. And every process requires time, repetition, and pauses. When one piece of information comes in one after another without a break, the brain can't decide what's relevant, what should be kept, and what can be discarded. This information overload creates a state of cognitive saturation. The brain begins to receive more than it can process. To protect itself, it starts filtering more aggressively. Much information is quickly discarded, not due to lack of interest but due to lack of mental space. The result is a constant feeling of internal superficiality. Another effect of this process is the difficulty in constructing internal narratives. Thoughts become loose, disconnected. Ideas don't easily connect. The person feels they know many things but can't access them when needed. This generates insecurity, frustration, and often unfair self-criticism. There is also a direct impact on attention. When everything is fast and shallow, the brain gets used to not staying on a single point for very long. Depth begins to seem tiring. Reading something longer, reflecting on a complex idea, or sustaining a thought requires an effort that the mind doesn't practice often. Not because it can't, but because it hasn't had the opportunity to train it in an environment that favors consolidation. This lack of consolidation directly affects the feeling of mental identity. The person begins to feel that they are always up to date, but rarely certain of anything. Decisions become more difficult because there is a lack of solid internal foundations. Opinions change rapidly. Convictions seem fragile. The mind adapts to the flow but loses its anchoring. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the role of consolidation completely changes how we interpret these cognitive failures. When you realize that the problem isn't inability, but a lack of real pauses, something transforms in how you perceive your own mind. The guilt begins to subside. The confusion gains context. The brain needs moments of apparent idleness to function well. Those instants when nothing is being consumed, answered, or resolved. It is in these moments that it organizes memories, connects ideas, and creates meaning. When these spaces disappear from the routine, the mind remains active but loses depth. The impact of this on the young adult's journey is enormous. Living at a fast pace, with an excess of information and few pauses, the brain begins to operate constantly in input mode, rarely in integration mode. This generates a constant feeling of being full and empty at the same time. Full of stimuli, empty of clarity. This dynamic also influences how a person judges themselves. Without understanding the context, they begin to attribute lapses to personal failings. They question their own ability, their own intelligence, their own potential. When, in reality, they are dealing with a mental system that is not having enough time to organize itself. When this understanding begins to emerge, small revelations appear. Memory ceases to be seen as something that disappears, and begins to be understood as something that needs space to exist. Attention ceases to be seen as weakness and begins to be perceived as a direct reflection of the environment. The mind stops seeming broken and begins to seem overloaded. This shift in mindset is part of a broader transformation. It changes decisions, changes expectations, and changes the relationship with one's own internal rhythm. The journey ceases to be about trying to absorb everything and becomes about better choosing what deserves to be integrated. This doesn't happen abruptly but begins with awareness. And when this awareness sets in, it becomes easier to see how information overload, multitasking, sleep deprivation, and constant stress all form a single backdrop. An environment where the brain receives a lot, processes little, and is pressured as if it were operating at its best possible state. Cognitive lapses in this context cease to be a mystery and become a clear sign that something needs space to breathe. This insight paves the way for understanding other, even more subtle elements of mental functioning, linked to how emotions, expectations, and identity directly interfere with the way the brain organizes reality. If this resonated with you in any way, right, this makes sense to me. There is an even more subtle element at play behind the scenes of these cognitive lapses, and perhaps that is why it is so difficult to perceive: the weight of intense emotions on reasoning. Anxiety, social comparison, and performance pressure are not merely uncomfortable emotional states. They consume real cognitive resources, occupy mental space, and drain the energy the brain needs to focus, remember, organize, and decide clearly. The brain doesn't separate emotion and thought as we often imagine. They share the same circuits, the same energy, the same mental budget. When a large portion of this energy is being spent dealing with fear, expectation, insecurity, or the need for approval, much less is left for more refined cognitive tasks. The result isn't an obvious collapse, but a gradual loss of clarity. Anxiety is a clear example of this. It keeps the mind projected into the future, constantly anticipating negative scenarios, problems, and possibilities. Even when nothing is actually happening, the brain acts as if something needs to be resolved urgently. This state consumes continuous attention. The mind becomes too busy monitoring risks to fully dedicate itself to the present. Thoughts begin to overlap, interrupt each other, and get lost along the way. Social comparison adds another layer of stress. In an environment where everyone seems to be advancing, achieving, and performing, the brain enters a constant state of evaluation. Am I doing well enough? Am I behind? Am I falling behind? These questions don't just stay at the conscious level. They continue to be processed behind the scenes, draining mental energy. The attention that could be focused on a concrete task is divided by an incessant internal dialogue. The pressure to perform completes this cycle. The feeling that one must be right, produce, evolve, and prove their worth all the time creates a state of permanent tension. The brain begins to operate under internal surveillance. Every mistake seems dangerous. Every lapse seems like a sign of failure. In this context, cognitive functions that require calmness, exploration, and flexibility begin to be impaired. Working memory, which is responsible for keeping information active while we think, is one of the first to suffer. When the mind is emotionally overloaded, it loses its ability to sustain ideas for long enough. The person forgets what they were going to say, gets lost in their reasoning, and needs to reread the same thing several times. Not because you don't understand, but because mental energy is being diverted to dealing with intense emotions. Focus also becomes fragmented. Strong emotions pull attention inward. The brain begins to revolve around internal concerns instead of fully connecting with what lies ahead. Even simple activities seem to require excessive effort. Clarity diminishes. The feeling of always being half present becomes frequent. The most delicate aspect is that this process is often misinterpreted. People believe they are becoming less capable, less intelligent, or less focused. Few realize that their reasoning isn't weak, it's competing with an intense emotional load. The brain is trying to handle many things at once, and strong emotions always take priority. There's a hidden truth here. The brain prioritizes emotion because, for it, emotion is linked to social and psychological survival. Belonging, being accepted, not failing, not being rejected, all of this is interpreted as vital. When these issues dominate the internal landscape, the brain redirects resources to protect them, even if this temporarily compromises cognitive performance. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding this relationship between emotion and cognition completely changes the narrative about mental failures. When you realize that you're not losing capacity, but rather expending too much emotional energy, something reorganizes itself internally. Self-criticism begins to lose its power. Confusion ceases to seem like a personal flaw and starts to be seen as a consequence of a demanding emotional context. This shift in mindset is transformative. It allows one to observe their own mind more honestly. Instead of fighting against lapses, the person begins to perceive what is occupying internal space. Unspoken worries, silent comparisons, unrealistic expectations. All of this weighs on them. All of this consumes attention. The journey of young adulthood is marked by intense emotions precisely because it is a phase of identity construction. Important decisions are being made. Paths are being defined. There is a lot at stake. The emotional impact of this is inevitable. The problem arises when the brain is expected to function with maximum clarity while carrying this weight without pauses. As this understanding begins to emerge, small revelations appear. Difficulty focusing gains context. Faulty memory ceases to seem random. The mind begins to be seen as a system sensitive to the emotional environment, not as a machine that should function perfectly all the time. This awareness also changes the relationship with one's own rhythm. The person begins to realize that it is not possible to demand high cognitive performance while living in a state of constant comparison and continuous anxiety. Mental clarity does not arise solely from techniques or effort. It depends on emotional space. And when this space begins to be recognized as necessary, it becomes easier to understand why so many cognitive failures appear together at this stage of life. Information overload, stress, sleep deprivation, and intense emotions do not act separately. They add up, reinforce each other, and create a scenario where the brain needs to choose where to invest its limited energy. This understanding opens the way to look even deeper into how these factors connect and how the mind reacts when it begins to recover internal space, even if gradually. It is at this point that other layers of brain function begin to reveal themselves, showing that many failures are not signs of loss, but of adaptation. If this made sense to you on any level, comment below. This makes sense to me. After understanding how sleep, stress, information overload, and emotional burden drain mental energy, there's a fundamental point that needs to be clear, and which usually brings enormous relief when finally understood. In the vast majority of cases, these cognitive lapses are not a disease. They are not a sign that something is broken, nor a harbinger of irreversible loss. They are, above all, a signal. The human brain communicates all the time. Not always through words, but through sensations, limits, and functional responses. When something starts to fail repeatedly, it doesn't happen by chance. It's a biological language. A request for adjustment. A silent warning that the pace, the way it's used, or the context is demanding more than the system can sustain in a healthy way. There is a hidden truth that is rarely stated clearly. The brain does not collapse without first trying to protect itself. It doesn't fail randomly. It reduces functions, simplifies processes, and limits access as a preservation strategy. This means that many cognitive failures are, in practice, functional defense mechanisms. When attention begins to waver, when memory becomes unstable, when reasoning loses fluency, the brain is signaling that it needs to reorganize priorities. It is saying, indirectly, that the current cost is too high. It's not a system error. It's the system trying to avoid something worse. This perspective completely changes the mindset. Instead of seeing these lapses as a personal flaw, they are viewed as feedback. Honest feedback on how the mind is being used. The problem is that we live in a culture that interprets any drop in performance as weakness, when often it is simply a healthy limit being exceeded. Functional cognitive impairments are reversible precisely because they do not involve structural damage. They do not indicate degeneration, but adaptation. The brain adjusts its functioning to the perceived context. If the context changes, the response changes along with it. This is extremely important to understand because it gives back to the person something that fear usually takes away: the feeling of possibility. Young adults, when experiencing these setbacks, often enter a state of emotional alert. The fear arises of missing out, of no longer being who they once were, of not being able to keep up. This fear in itself further increases the mental load. The brain begins to be pressured precisely at the moment it is asking for relief. The cycle closes. But when one understands that these failures are signs and not sentences, something transforms internally. The relationship with one's own mind changes. The person begins to listen instead of fighting. They begin to observe instead of judging. And this opens up space for real adjustments. These adjustments don't need to be extreme. The brain doesn't ask for a perfect life without stress or challenges. It asks for coherence, a minimally sustainable rhythm, less fragmented attention, sufficient pauses to reorganize information, emotional space to avoid living in a constant state of threat. Small changes in context can generate large impacts on cognitive functioning. Relief comes precisely from this understanding. It's not necessary to fix the brain. It's necessary to stop forcing it to operate outside the conditions for which it was designed. Functional cognitive failures are like lights on the dashboard. Ignoring them doesn't make the car run better. Understanding them allows you to adjust your course. This perspective also highlights something essential in the young adult's mental journey: confidence. Not that blind confidence that everything will always work out, but a more mature confidence based on understanding. The mind ceases to be seen as an unpredictable enemy and begins to be recognized as a sensitive, intelligent, and adaptive system. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding cognitive failures as signals opens an important door. A door that leads to the most transformative question of all in this context. If the brain is signaling, what exactly is it asking to change? Not in the sense of external demands, but at the most basic level of mental self-care. This question completely shifts the focus. Instead of trying to produce more at any cost, curiosity arises about how to create better conditions for thinking, remembering, and deciding. The mindset changes from demanding more to adjusting, from confrontation to listening. And this profoundly alters how the brain responds. The impact of this goes beyond cognition. It affects decisions, daily choices, the relationship with time, and with one's own expectations. The journey ceases to be about proving ability and becomes about maintaining lucidity. And lucidity doesn't arise from pressure. It arises from the balance possible within each person's reality. When this understanding begins to solidify, something curious happens. Many flaws spontaneously diminish. Not because they were directly combated, but because the context that generated them begins to be questioned. The brain, perceiving less threat, gradually reopens access to functions that were temporarily limited. This is one of the greatest revelations of this process. The mind responds quickly when it realizes it no longer needs to defend itself all the time. It reorganizes itself. It regains clarity. It resumes fluidity. Not magically, but in a way that is coherent with the conditions offered. And it is precisely at this point that the conversation becomes even more interesting, because understanding that failure is not a disease, but a sign, prepares the ground for looking more honestly at the internal adjustments that truly make a difference. Adjustments that don't appear as quick fixes, but as subtle changes in attitude, attention, and pace. From this point, it becomes possible to see how small daily choices profoundly shape mental functioning, and how awareness of these signals can completely transform the way a young adult relates to their own brain. If this resonated with you in any way, write this down. I'm on this journey too. When all of this starts to fall into place, something important changes in how a person sees themselves. Understanding one's own brain isn't just about satisfying scientific curiosity or explaining strange mental phenomena. It's primarily about transforming how internal pressure works. Because most of the suffering linked to cognitive lapses doesn't come from the lapses themselves, but from how they are interpreted. For a long time, the dominant narrative was simple and cruel. If you're young, your mind should be able to handle everything. If it can't, the problem is you. You lack focus, you lack discipline, you lack effort. But throughout this conversation it became clear that this interpretation completely ignores the inner workings of the brain. It ignores the accumulated impact of stress, sleep deprivation, overstimulation, emotional overload, and the absence of real breaks. When you understand this, your mindset begins to change. Automatic self-criticism loses its power. Instead of attacking yourself for not performing as you'd like, a more honest curiosity arises. Under what conditions is my mind trying to function right now? This simple question is already a form of mental self-care. It shifts the focus from blame to understanding. This change has a profound impact on one's personal journey. The individual stops living in constant conflict with their own mind and begins to develop a more strategic relationship with it. Not in the sense of controlling everything, but of respecting boundaries, recognizing signals, and adjusting expectations. This doesn't diminish ambition or the desire to grow. On the contrary, it makes growth more sustainable. There's a hidden truth that's rarely stated clearly. Mental clarity doesn't come from pressure, it comes from favorable conditions. Focus doesn't arise from extreme demands, it comes from inner space. Memory doesn't improve with fear of making mistakes, it improves when the brain has time to consolidate. The sooner this is understood, the less energy is wasted fighting symptoms that are, in fact, messages. This understanding also changes everyday decisions. Small choices begin to be seen through a different lens. The pace of information consumption, the way time is organized, the amount of stimuli accepted without filtering, all of this ceases to be neutral and begins to be understood as an active part of cognitive functioning. The mind is not something separate from routine. It is shaped by it. Throughout this reflection, it becomes evident that many cognitive failures do not indicate regression, but transition. They arise during moments of transformation, when the mind is trying to adapt to new demands, new roles, and new expectations. The problem is not going through this phase. The problem is going through it unconsciously, attacking oneself in the process. When a person begins to see the brain as a sensitive ally, and not as a faulty machine, something reorganizes itself internally. Self-criticism loses intensity. Anxiety decreases. Clarity begins to return, not because all problems have disappeared, but because the brain no longer needs to expend so much energy defending itself. This is a silent but powerful turning point. The relationship with one's own mind becomes more mature. Less based on comparison and more based on observation. Less on self-criticism and more on adjustment. And this completely changes how lapses, distractions, and forgetfulness are interpreted throughout life. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding your own brain is not an end in itself. It's the beginning of a new way of navigating decisions, expectations, and mental challenges. When you recognize the signals before you turn them into labels, you create space for more conscious and less reactive choices. This awareness doesn't solve everything at once, but it creates fertile ground. Ground where the mind can reorganize itself, where focus can reappear, where memory can regain stability. Not as an unattainable ideal, but as a possible process within everyone's reality. And when this understanding begins to solidify, the question ceases to be "what's wrong with me?" and becomes "what is my brain trying to show me?" This shift in perspective, in itself, already reduces much of the burden that many people carry in silence. If at any point in this conversation you thought, "this happens to me," comment below, "this makes sense to me." If you've made it this far, it's because this topic has touched on some real point in your own experience. Perhaps in a lapse you always found strange, perhaps in that feeling of confusion that never had a name, or perhaps just in the realization that your brain has been asking for more understanding than demands. And just by stopping to reflect on this, something important is already happening. If this conversation resonated with you, leave a comment saying this message was for me, or I'm with you until the end. This shows me that you were truly present, following the reasoning to the end, and helps keep this exchange alive. If at any point you felt that this content helped you better understand your own brain, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to say that you want to continue exploring this type of explanation, with more depth and less judgment. The idea here is always the same, to look at the human mind with curiosity, not fear. And if you felt that connection throughout the video, leave a like as a silent sign that this conversation was worthwhile. It helps this content reach more people who are also going through this without knowing how to explain it. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic. Click on it and continue watching it.